Thank you all so much for coming out on this beautiful evening to spend a little time with me as I talk about some incredible people I've come to know over the past few years. I will tell you I'm still having a little bit of altitude issues, so at some point I'm probably going to cough my head off, but just so you know. So how this started for me was not a book I intended to write or stories I intended to tell, but I had been asked to speak at an Army convention in 2017, and I was a substitute. The main speaker had dropped out, and so they called me, which is how I get many things when someone else drops out. And I had just finished reading a story about an incredible woman from World War II who worked undercover as a counterintelligence agent, and I'd never heard of it. And so part of my thought process was, why don't I know some of these stories? So I talked about her at this conference, and then I started collecting more stories. And by 2019, I had a folder full as the members of the greatest generation continue to pass from this earth. So by 2019, anybody watch The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel? Okay, so in 2019, Alex Borstein received the Emmy for Best Supporting Actress. And when she received that Emmy, she stood up and said, in World War II, my grandmother was about to be shot into a pit. She turned to the guard and said, what happens if I step out of line? And he said, well, I don't have the heart to shoot you, but somebody will. She stepped out of line. And for that, I am here today. And for that, my children are here today. So step out of line, ladies. Step out of line. No. Okay. So that's where I started talking about some World War II stories. And when I'd finished talking about them and that book was published, one of my girlfriends said, well, that was nice, but you need to write about my husband's grandmother. So she was a police officer in New York City starting in 1918. So I'll tell you a little bit about her too. And then there's the surprise, which is the next book, because I can't help myself now. So this is that first story. This is Stephanie Rader. Stephanie grew up in Poughkeepsie, New York. Her parents were Polish immigrants, and she didn't speak English till she started grade school. So she spoke Polish perfectly and with a regional accent. She went to Cornell. Her parents sold their wedding rings so she could go to school. And when she graduated with a degree in chemistry, she couldn't find a job. So she ends up in New York City working for a petroleum company. When the Army announced they were opening up the Women's Army Corps to people who wanted to join and serve, she said, maybe I can get a start. And so she joined the Women's Army Corps and then drove through the night to lovely downtown Fort Des Moines, Iowa for training. She ended up staying there to work for the next year or so. This was in 1943, and she became a training officer. Do we have any veterans here? Awesome. And have you ever worked in basic training? Basic training is boring. You do the same thing over and over again every 8 weeks. You teach them how to march, say yes sir, no ma'am. And when they've got some of that down pat, you send them off and you do it again. She wanted a greater challenge. One of her friends from New York said, why don't you apply to OSS? What's that? The Office of Strategic Services, which at that time was the precursor to what is now the CIA. She applied, and because of her language skills, she's selected. Her first assignment was in London, right at the beginning of 1945, and there she meets her husband, Bill Rader. Bill was a pilot, a bomber pilot in Northeast England, and he would come to London, hopefully to meet American girls. Now, Stephanie is one of 30 U.S. women in London. There's 350,000 men. She liked those odds. And so they went out on a blind date, but he had to wait 2 weeks because her schedule was a little packed. And finally, when they went out, he said, I saw you on the street yesterday. You didn't see me. And she said, well, I didn't know you yet. But for years after they got married, he would tell people he picked her up off the streets of London. Now, her next job was a little more dangerous, a lot more dangerous. They sent her to Warsaw, Poland in August of 1945. Warsaw had been nearly destroyed. She was there in the one building that still had electricity and water. It was a hotel, along with a number of other nations that had their embassy staffs there. Her job, travel the countryside, like you're looking for lost family, and write reports on troop movements, Nazis who were on the run, what is happening with the communists from Russia in the upcoming elections. And she did that and did it quite well until the next year when she was outed by someone in the Paris office and had to return home. This picture is from 2017 on the right, her burial at Arlington. She had never received an award for what she did. And so the Legion of Merit was presented at her funeral. And the Army representative there at that time said she was a true warrior. So I am greatly impacted and respectful and grateful for what Stephanie Rader did. You know, I touched this thing before. Oh, see, all you do is complain, and it works. This was the second story I found. This is Hilda Eisen. Hilda, too, was in Poland. She grew up about 75 miles southwest of Warsaw. And when she was 19, she got married and moved away from home, just as the Nazis invaded. Her entire family was taken, and they were put into a ghetto in nearby Lublin. That middle picture is of the Lublin ghetto. She and her new husband, David, were on the run for about 2 weeks before they were captured and ended up in that ghetto. So she's escaped once. They escaped from that ghetto. She talks the guard into opening the gate. I need to go out. I have to do a little shopping. And away they go. They spend the next 3 years living in a forest near there. One of those forests so dark the sunlight never hits the floor of the forest. Can't have fires at night because they'll find you. And there were a group of them who were partisans who then fought back. One day she is out gathering firewood. Excuse me, they can have fires during the day. But she's picked up by a Gestapo patrol and taken to a nearby schoolhouse where they have their offices. And she's locked into a room and knows that night they're going to interrogate her. And she said, I am not going to take this. She jumps from the second-story window and runs back to the forest. 3 escapes. Spends the rest of the war in that forest. Her husband is killed by the Polish people. At the end of the war, she travels back to her village, only to find there's nothing left and no one there. But there's this nice guy there named Harry Eisen. She and Harry went to junior high together. She didn't like him then. But there's 4 young people here now who have nowhere to go and no family. And they decide to go forward together. I had to read this story 3 times to say, she did what? And she escaped that many times. And now there is one more escape, because post-war Poland is a dangerous place for Jewish people. They travel south towards Munich and spend the next 1.5 years in a refugee camp. And then they immigrate to the U.S. But they were only able to immigrate because she has a very distant cousin who agrees to sponsor them, which is what you had to have at the time. They end up in California, near Los Angeles. Harry gets a job. The only job he can find is in a hot dog factory because he doesn't speak English. But they save their money, and they're planning to do better. That first Christmas, they have their first child. It's Christmas Eve. There's a knock on their door. All of that fear comes back. You know, a knock on the door is not a good thing. So they don't open it. They wait until the next morning. They open the door, and they find that all their neighbors have brought presents for the baby. And to me, that is the moment when they could actually go forward and begin to find that new life. So with the pennies they've saved, they buy a few chickens, and Harry starts selling eggs on the back of his bicycle. By the time they sold their business, Norco Farms, if anybody's heard of it, In 2002, they had an annual income of over 10 million, a staff of 350, and 800,000 chickens. If you think about starting something from nothing, or even less than nothing, this is the most incredible story there is, I think, in some ways. But there's more people that I kept finding their stories and wanted to tell them all. And my publisher said, you know, most stories that are nonfiction are about 3 to 5 people. You have 15. Who do you want to drop? Nobody. And they finally understood that. And this is Kate Flynn Nolan. Now, Kate grew up near Pennsylvania, near where I grew up in Philadelphia. And when she graduated from nursing school in 1943, she decided to join the Army Nurse Corps. 56,000 nurses served in World War II. Kate wanted to be a flight nurse because she thought it sounded cool. So they sent her to what is now Fort McDill, Florida, and then the program was closed. So they reassigned her, as the Army does, to a combat hospital heavy casualty. So there's now all of this training leading up to D-Day in 1944. And then nurses had to put up the tents. There's 18 nurses in a combat hospital. Anybody ever put up a GP medium? That is not fun, is it? And it takes all of these people to pound the stakes in the ground and then pull on the ropes to get that thing to come up. Every time they would move, they would have to do that. And that's what they were preparing for. Her unit lands on Utah Beach in July of 1944. Kate is my size, which is rather tall. And so she kind of goes under the waves. And the other nurses pick her up and drag her onto the beach. And then they followed Patton's Third Army, infantry and armor units throughout France, through Germany, Luxembourg, all the way through to the end of the war. She earned 5 battle stars. What they would do when they were shelled was they would roll their patients out of the cots onto the ground and lay on top of them to protect them. In the years after the war, she would go to reunions. You know, the Battle of the Bulge reunion, because that was one of her major events. And one time she was there, a man came up to her and wrapped her up in a bear hug and said, "I want to thank you for saving my life." And she said, "I never thought I'd see anyone again whose life I had helped save." It was a big, big, meaningful event for her. And that's her in the middle of that picture on the right. Now, Kate never got promoted past first lieutenant, because if she had, they would have had to move her, and she was needed where she was. This picture of her in the bottom is at the Women's Memorial in Washington, D.C. in 2007, at the 10th anniversary. And look at this, it's a whole new generation looking at her and saying thank you. And look at the efforts for what you did and how you've influenced us. Now, I didn't get to talk to Kate, but I talked to her children, because she and James had 7 children. 3 of her sons served, and her granddaughter served in Iraq. Family legacy. So my editor gave me a question: how did they get back together after the end of the war? So what I did was call up her oldest daughter, Marianne, and say, "Can you tell me how your parents got together?" Again, the 7 children, she said, "We will have to convene, and we'll get back with you." So about 2 weeks later, she finally called me back and said, "We have talked, and none of us know." But then they were sad because they hadn't asked. So if any of you have, how many of you have parents, grandparents who served in World War II? Ask them. While they're still with us, ask them. Ask them their stories. And then there's Millie. Now, Millie had several nicknames. Millie was one, Sexy Rexie was another. And she wanted to fly. She wanted to join the WASP and fly. So she took flying lessons when she was still in El Paso. She moved to D.C., where she worked for a while at what was then the Army War College. and when Reagan National Airport was 2 planes and 1 little building. But she got in. She got into class 44-7 and graduated in August 1944. But she only flew for a few months because the program shut down later that year because the war was going that well, excuse me, that many pilots were returning and they needed them to take some of the jobs that the women held. There were over 1,000 women in the WASP, the Women Air Service Pilots. Now, the men who were pilots in World War II flew one type of plane. The WASPs flew everything in the inventory because they would ferry them from the factory to the bases, excuse me, or they would have other jobs. Millie's job was to pull targets for ground and air gunners. It's not a job I'd want to have because you could see the tracers coming through the plane. And while she did this one day, still in Texas, one of the ground gunners shot the little target off the back end of her plane. So she lands, and one of the instructors comes up to her and says, "You lost the target, Millie. You see it? It's over in that field. Here's the keys. Go get it." What he didn't know was that while Millie could fly, and fly really well, she didn't know how to drive. So she leapfrogged that Jeep across the field to get it back. And this is her in 2010 at Mount Rushmore, wearing the Congressional Gold Medal that the WASPs received. Just a few years ago, really. She is now buried at Arlington, which was one of the last fights because they would not receive veterans status. They wore a uniform. They were told they would be in the Army Air Corps, and then it just didn't work out. So the granddaughter of one of the WASPs led the fight to get them the permission to be rested in Arlington. So I have been there to visit Millie. I've also been there to visit many of the others I talk about. But I have to tell you about Charity. Charity Adams grew up in Columbia, South Carolina. She graduated from college with a triple major: science, math, and Latin. She was working on her master's degree at Ohio State when she too decided to join the Army, join the Women's Army Corps. She too ends up at downtown Fort Des Moines, Iowa, working in basic training. It's segregated at the time, but I keep imagining about the connections here. Did she ever meet Stephanie Check? Maybe. More that I worked on this, the more I found that there were people who crossed each other's paths, or they knew some of the same people, or they had friends who knew each other. And I was amazed by that. She too was bored with basic training. She too wanted a greater challenge. And she wanted to command. So when I wrote this book, it was beginning in January of 2020. My requirement for the publisher was to finish it by the end of April. I had 3 months to do this. And when the pandemic started, I had written nothing. Now, fear is a wonderful motivator. So I started buying books online and looking at those. And many people wrote autobiographies in 1947, 48, a lot of them just for their families. But I've read her autobiography, and I was amazed at everything she did to teach herself what she needed to know to command. She taught herself logistics, how to run the dining facility. She sold war bonds. She traveled with the band. And so when she was finally told in 1944 that we're going to give you a command, she was ready. So it's early January 1945. She's on that transport plane headed to London, and they had said, "Don't you open that envelope until you're over the water, and then you'll know what your assignment is." She looks down, there's the Chesapeake Bay, that's good enough. She opens the envelope and learns that she is now the commander of the 6888 Central Postal Directory Battalion, to be headquartered in Birmingham, England. Now, most of the time when you read about units that deploy in World War II, they've had 1 to 2, maybe longer years to prepare. She met the soldiers in her unit, 855 of them, when they arrived off the boat. So we have more pictures of her and a little bit of video because they did a pass and review in the city of Birmingham. After that ended, the work began. So she takes them the next day to the warehouses where the backlog of mail is. Because of the pace of operations on the continent, much mail had not been delivered for 2, maybe longer, up to 3 years. They open those doors, and there it is. 17 million pieces of mail. Packages, old Christmas packages, little rat eyes in the dark having a snack. And she takes her soldiers and divides them into 3 shifts. They work 24 hours a day. They've been given 6 months to do this mission, and other units had tried it and failed. So each shift clears 56,000 pieces of mail. And then the mail starts flowing to the forward units. They finish this in 3 months. So my Army friends, what happens to you when you do well with a mission? That's right, you get more. You get more. So then they are sent to Paris to clear the diplomatic mail. Again, like many units after the war, their story is classified. And with everything else that we're seeing in stories about units after the war, it's lost. Until just a few years ago when it resurfaces. And part of that first effort was to build a monument at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. And that's what you see in the lower right corner. That's retired Master Sergeant Liz Helm, and she's saying, "We stand on their shoulders." There has also been a congressional gold medal effort for this unit, which they have not received yet the medal, but the award was signed last year. And it's, well, you know, there's a little problem with some supply chain issues still. So there are, I believe, still 6 living members of the 6888, and the medal is coming for them. And if you're watching, Tyler Perry has made a movie about this unit. It will be on Netflix on December 20th with a Christmas release. Kerry Washington plays Charity Adams. Susan Sarandon plays Eleanor Roosevelt. And Oprah is in there somewhere. But I want to transition now and tell you a little bit about my police friend. This is Mary Foley. Now, Mary Foley is a little bit older than those I have talked about who served in World War II. The majority of them were born in 1920, right after women received the vote, right as they thought their future would be a little different. And for the contributions they made, at the end of the war, everybody went home. They were only there to serve for the emergency. And in 1948, President Truman signed into law the requirement that the armed services would continue to admit women based on their performance, based on their contributions. And a few months later, he desegregated the armed forces. That had a major effect. Now, Mary Foley talked about some of the things she did in World War I and World War II that were much like what the Women's Army Corps did. But I'll tell you, she was born at the end of a rich era in New York, and there were so many immigrants coming in. She graduated from high school in 1904 and began to work for the city, helping new immigrants find their lives in New York. How do you find a job? How do you get your children into school? She was pretty much what we would call a social worker. And she was a very social young woman. She liked to sing Irish songs and enjoy partying. And she met this nice man who she married in 1905. And her mother and father did not approve. As good Catholics, she was marrying a divorced man. So while she was married at a church, it was not in it. And 2 years later, they had 2 small children. We come a little bit forward into the teens, 1915, 16, and the New York Police Department develops a organization that they want to be like a neighborhood watch. You're back. Okay, so she joins this police reserve, and then she helps recruit 2,000 more women to join it. The police reserve had uniforms. The people who worked for the police department, the women who worked for it, did not. I have not yet figured that out. partially because there's not many records to look at. The NYPD destroyed all of their files before 1930. Wonder why. But she joins in 1923, goes through all of the training, which includes jiu-jitsu at the time, which was quite revolutionary, weapons training. She serves first in the 19th Precinct in Manhattan, and then, unfortunately, her husband dies in 1928, and she is now the sole provider for her family. They moved to Queens, where she's now in the 108th Precinct. She's the only woman in the precinct out of about 85 officers. And so she gets to do a lot of the jobs that are difficult. This picture on the left is a newspaper meme talking about a serial killer. And one of her first jobs there was to be bait. Oh, so glad I moved here. She does her job very well. Don't worry, I left the oxygen. She's also not political, and too many people were. Well, if I hadn't run all over town today, I would still have a voice. She also becomes seconded to the district attorney's office and is asked to manage all of the witnesses in the mobsters trial for Thomas Dewey. And this is Lucky Luciano's trial. So she has to escort them into the courtroom in the morning. This is another policewoman escorting some of them in. These are all ladies of ill repute, which is how they brought down Lucky Luciano and his compatriots. So she is doing that for the next 2 years. By now, we're up to about 1938, 1939, and she's assigned to go undercover in the American Nazi movement in New York. Now you see why this is irresistible, this story. So in February of 1939, the Bund, which is the name for the Nazi movement, and it was wildly popular in New York. They held a birthday party for George Washington, and this is at Grand Central. That's 30,000 people came to this. And she is there, Nazi armband and the whole bit, and hoping she doesn't see anybody she knows. They later arrested the head of the Bund, Fritz Kuhn, put him on trial, but she had to stay undercover until all of the trials were finished and they were sent to jail. And I just had to show you this because my main source of research at this time is now New York newspapers. By 1900, there were 50 newspapers in New York City. The one on the left is about one of her first jobs, which was to search a woman who'd been arrested, only to find the woman has a gun and is pointing it at her. So there is an article in the local paper about how she takes down the woman who fought like a wildcat. So this is about the time of the beginning of the Tarzan movies. So she would walk into the precinct station and she would hear the Tarzan yells. So she went to the captain and said, I don't want to be in the news anymore. So I had a hard time finding more stories about her after that. But what really fascinates me is this other picture, because it's a meme. Who would have thought they made memes in the 1920s? How did they get that bad person to hold her mouth open and do that? I don't know that they had the technology for that. Okay, well, anyway, I was fascinated with it. And just as a preview, when I finished working on this book and sent it to the publisher, they said, oh, good, you're doing a series. And I said, I am. So they have just, about a month ago, approved my next book, which is going to be called The Girls Who Beat the Odds, and it's about sports. And it's due to come out just before the Winter Olympics in 2026. And this is the first chapter in this. Gretchen Fraser, who grew up near Seattle, learned to ski when she was 15, would take the train down to Sun Valley, met her husband on that train along the way, is planning to ski in the 1940 Olympics. There's no Olympics in 1940. There's no Olympics in 1944. Her husband is deployed working with the Navy, and she spends the war years teaching wounded soldiers how to ski in the winter and how to horseback ride in the summer. Rehabilitation. Had a lifelong commitment to rehabilitation. So is she going to ski in 1948? She hadn't had much time to practice or to improve her skills, but she goes. San Moritz, there's the clock. When she comes up to ski, most of the people leave the bottom of the hill. Why would we watch an American? No American has ever won a medal in the Winter Olympics. So she's up there in that gate, in that crouch, and this is the first time they've used the clock that works from the bottom of the mountain electronically up to the top, and it malfunctions. So while they're fixing it, the referee at the top of the mountain won't let her move. So she stays in that crouch for 17 minutes before they finally let her go. And she wins the gold medal. So if you go to Sun Valley, it's all about Gretchen Fraser. So she's the first person I wanted to write about in my next book, because I'm not only talking about what happened with some of these earlier athletes during the war years, but their resilience. And then she spent the rest of her life mentoring, supporting, training, helping next generations. And it just blows me away. So just a word from our sponsor. The World War II Museum in New Orleans opened an exhibit on women in World War II in last Veterans Day. It closed there in July and will tour the U.S. for the next year. But you can see quite a bit about this online, and if you have the chance to go see the exhibit, it's really great. And now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening to me talk about what I know about these incredible average people who were put in extraordinary situations and rose to them. Now, we have a saying in the Army that crisis does not build character, it reveals it. And I saw this over and over again. And I'd like to tell you more about them or answer whatever questions you may have. Oh, and then there's that. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I get mail from the World War II Museum, and I just want to comment. My father has a brick, so you can get a brick for your relative. But my mother, who served as the telephone operator at Wool Chamberlain Field in Minneapolis during the war, could also have a brick. You've just got to be able to get all this information like Wool Chamberlain Airfield on your brick. And I was wondering if you know how many women have bricks at the World War II Museum.
Alas, a question I know nothing about.
Well, I would like to encourage all of you to consider honoring your relative in this fashion. You have to pay some money, but I think that would be nice for your descendants.
There are also bricks at the National D-Day Memorial in Bedford, Virginia. And so I was there for this year's D-Day commemoration, which was several days of events. And there are women who have bricks there as well. Now, so are there women buried in Normandy? At the Normandy Cemetery, there's 4. One was a nurse who was killed in a plane crash, and 3 were members of the 6888 who were killed in a Jeep accident on their way back towards Paris. But I will find out the answer to that just in case anybody else ever asks me that yet. Okay?
Hey, this has been a great presentation. I would love to hear a little bit about your experience and kind of your evolution through the military.
Well, I came into the military just as a way to gain experience. I wanted to work in public relations, and I ended up in the military police corps. Don't get me wrong, I loved that, but I still wanted to get to where I thought I had the best skill set, and it took me a couple of years to do that. I had a perfectly average first 10 years, 12 years or so, and then I decided that if I wanted to be competitive, I had to do something more. And what I decided to force myself to do was learn how to speak. Well, the first time I saw myself on a news program, I shrieked and fell over. So none of you will ever see that either. So I spoke at a conference. I agreed to sign up and give this presentation. How many of you love public speaking? Yeah. Yeah, that's how I felt that day. So I'm in the back room. They had mic'd me already while someone else is speaking, and I'm looking out through the curtain, and I can see all 300 of them sitting there. And you could hear me. So they turned the microphone off. But I worked at it, and I got better at it, and it led me to being able to train senior officers in media relations, giving interviews. Then when I moved to Germany, I taught the role of a free press in a democracy. And I just did everything the Army asked you to do at each level. Now, does that guarantee you move up? No. It doesn't. I mean, there's dozens of people who could do the jobs I had or did. Sometimes it's luck and timing, and it's all that preparation. Or as I've heard, luck and timing happens when you do the work. And so that's how I ended up here.
All right, we have one over here. If you write a fourth book, what do you think it will be about?
They told me I could write on anything I wanted. So I'm going to plot and plan. I have no idea, but I'm going to enjoy myself with this. Right now I have a giant stack of books about sports on the floor, because there's no more room after I go out all the World War II books.
All the women you talk about are primarily based in Europe. I was wondering if you've come across any that went undercover or were serving in the Pacific during World War II.
Yeah, there's a couple in the book I've talked about who were in the Pacific. One of them was Betty McIntosh, who grew up in Pearl City, and she was a newspaper reporter. So during the war, she ended up moving to D.C., going to work for the OSS, and her job was propaganda, information operations, and she ended up in Burma and then China. Comes back from the war, works for Glamour magazine, is bored to death with that, and goes back into the CIA. She wrote a book in 1946 about her experiences with the OSS that I swear they would never let anyone publish now. I found out on eBay. Which is good because the original was $500, so I was glad to find the eBay version. I also have another story in there about a girl who was in China with her parents who were missionaries. And when the Japanese invaded China, they surrounded this boarding school of Westerners, and she was taken captive along with her brother and sister. So this girl spent 5 years of her childhood behind concertina wire before being reunited with her parents. So her story was more about the after effects, how it affected her growing up, what she did to give back. She was in Haddonfield, New Jersey, and she ended up running a juvenile detention center. Who better to understand kids behind bars than someone who'd spent their childhood in a prison camp? So her story is incredible too.
Right over here.
I'm sure that you researched so many, many women, and you could only put however many you put in your book. How did you decide which stories were worthy of the book?
Well, once you start on a project like this, you can't stop yourself. So I kept finding more afterwards. So I have been hinting broadly that I might like to do an updated version to the publisher. No one has heard me on this yet, but I'm still working on that. There were also several people I wanted to write about and couldn't because I couldn't find out enough about them or locate their family members or find any way to find photos of them, because I wanted to include pictures in this book, because I don't know these people as older. I know them as being 17 or 18 when they said, yeah, I'll do this. So Charity Adams, how old do you think she was as that commander? She was 25. And she also went in 4 years from second lieutenant to lieutenant colonel. Personally, I'm a little jealous of that.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about the process of writing the book and how long it took you from start to finish?
The way you should do it, the school solution here is that you do all the research first, and then you line it up as to how you think it should go together, and you outline your chapter, and then you do that one by one. And doing the footnotes in the correct Chicago Manual of Style format throughout. As I mentioned, I only had 3 months to put this together. So I did the writing simultaneously with the research. I would write a little bit, realize there was something I didn't know, and then go after it. And then come back. I don't recommend that. But once you've done it, it becomes a habit. And so I sort of did that in the same process with the second book. But by that point, I had told my agent, I am not doing this in 3 months. So how nice of them, I got 6. So as for the third book, I am on chapter 13 out of what will be 15, maybe 16. So I'm very close to the end because I didn't tell them I was working on it ahead.
Have you come across any modern day stories that you've been fascinated by?
Sure, that'll be in the sports book. Especially, one of the other people I talk about is a figure skater who won the gold in the 1952 Olympics. And one of the pictures I want, this is Tenley Albright, is there's a picture of her with every American gold medal figure skater from her time to today. And so it just shows the legacy, the mentorship, and how you bring along next generation. So there's so many, and I so worry about leaving someone out. So if you want that book, you might need a wheelbarrow, is what I'm thinking is going to happen with this one.
Mary Kay, I have a question that switches gears a little bit. You had the opportunity this morning to spend time with students at Vail Christian High School and this afternoon at Vail Mountain School. Thank you for being generous with your time and energy. I wonder if you could share what your experience has been like in Vail and maybe what inspired you to give so generously of your energy here in our community.
Well, you know, there's two types of leaders. One says, it was hard for me, it's going to be hard for everybody who follows me. And then the other type says, I don't want anybody to have some of the experiences that I had. Let me do what I can to be helpful. So if I can go talk to high school students anywhere, I will do that. By the way, I have been all through Colorado. I've spent a lot of time in Colorado Springs, Breckenridge, Durango, etc. I love Vail. Except for the oxygen part. But.
We've got a hand in the back there, and then Kat, I'll come to you. I'll ask you, we're in a community that is so incredible in part because of some very extraordinary women. So if you have a story to share of how incredible women shaped our community, this might be a nice opportunity to honor their stories.
Oh, I see what you're doing. This is going to be book 4, isn't it?
I just wanted to ask, it sounds like you have gotten to know these women through your readings and research. What do you find as a common thread in their character?
At first, what I thought I would find is that they were alone. You know, because there weren't that many of them. They were distributed physically in various locations. So they didn't have peers, they didn't have colleagues, they didn't have mentors, they didn't have support. And for those who were overseas, they didn't have mail for a very long time. So what I found was that wasn't true. A lot of them knew each other, or they knew of each other, or they followed what the others did. Any of the ones who were in the OSS knew about all of the others, where they were, what they did, and they admired them. So I think that was one of the main things I found, was that sense of connection that I wasn't expecting to find. I had told you a little bit about Kate Nolan and her 7 children. And so at one time her daughter called me and said, I want you to meet a friend of mine who's in New Jersey, okay? So it's her sister-in-law, actually. And her sister-in-law, Carolyn, then speaks to me and said, I was so excited to get your book from Mary Ann so I could read about her mother. And then I realized there was a chapter in there about Mary Previty, the little girl in China. She was my neighbor in Haddonfield. What are the chances of that type of connection? And so then she sent me pictures from Haddonfield, where Mary Previty, as an adult, in 1974, went to all of her neighbors and said, come on over, we're going to have a little brunch for the 4th of July. And once they were there, perhaps after Bloody Marys, or maybe mimosas, she said, we need to bring back patriotism in this community. We need to support our country. We need to have a parade every year. Now remember, this is just after President Nixon resigned. The Vietnam War is still going. But she got that going, and that parade has gone on for 50-some years now. Mary Previty passed away in 2019. There was no parade in 2020. But they put that flag which is the size of this side of the room, they put it up in front of her house, and people would come up to touch it. So in 2021, the parade came back. So I have a lot of pictures of that parade where her neighbors dressed up like paratroopers who had come in to liberate the camp where she was. And the kids handed out flyers to tell her story. So some of this lives on. It lives on, and it lives on, and there's connections with it. That's what I think is incredible.
You have an incredible, dry sense of humor.
I have not been in trouble as many times as you may think.
What I'd like to know is who recognized that in your career path, and how do you continue to use that energy to your advantage today?
Well, I think having a sense of humor is something that can diffuse tough situations if you're a commander or a leader. And I would use that to my advantage many times. Or I would make fun of my response to a situation if I got it wrong. Now, I had gone to a friend's promotion ceremony, and I was supposed to be speaking there. Well, I had lost my voice before that ceremony, and so when I came in, what I said was, well, I was just shouting so much with pure joy about this promotion. And so it helped everyone understand. So what you're doing is using it as a way to say things that might be unknown or difficult or hard to get across. And so I've always done that, plus sometimes I just can't help myself. No.
Back here.
So James mentioned that you spoke 2 schools here and that you obviously do this other places. It's a multi-part question. Can you talk a little bit about your reaction or what you learn talking to these young people? And then second, if there's a most surprising question you've been asked by them or a story that you could share.
I'll answer the most surprising part first. Last year, I spoke at a series of high schools. I was at Pearl Harbor for the Pearl Harbor Aviation Museum, and they brought in students from across various islands. And I talked about the women in this book, and the second book as well. And then a young lady asked me, so how old were you in World War II? So, what do you answer that? And, well, finally, I realized she probably wasn't referring to my aged appearance, but was actually saying, you know so much of this stuff, how do you know that? I think that's what she was asking me. So I think for sometimes, if there's a question that doesn't seem to make sense from a young person, you have to realize they don't have this background. So the class I spoke to this afternoon, the classes, one was a applied ethics class, and the other was what happened after 9/11. Now, the Army changed in 2012 when we started to realize that many of the 9/11 applicants were not coming in. And so this generation has no knowledge of it. To them, this might as well be like Pearl Harbor, it's back there. So bringing it to life and being able to say, I was there, not in World War II, but 9/11, I think is extremely important to say, we all have different perspectives. You're going to read a book perspective, but you need the perspectives of the people who experienced it.
We're all only wincing slightly that the 9/11 class was a history class.
Yeah.
Mary Kay, have you seen any changes in the military as women have taken on more and more leadership roles?
It's very difficult to talk about when things change because if you're not paying attention to it, I didn't realize when I started writing the police book that women didn't wear pants in New York City until 1974. Excuse me, I'm wearing heels, let me chase this guy down the street. Now, some of that is just, I didn't realize that. And I think, too, that there are changes that have continued in our military up until 2015 when all jobs were open to women. So if you've got the skill set and you can hang physically and do it, go for it. And when you're 18, 19, you don't think there's anything you can't do. Some of us have learned a little differently in the years past that, but that's what we believe then. So the more we normalize who's selected, the best person. We don't care where they came from, what their experiences were. If they can do the job and they're the best one for it, that's where we're going.
Are you aware of stories of women leaders from the military who've gone on to careers in corporate America or careers in nonprofit service, who took the skills that they learned in that environment and went on to have an influence in another sector?
Absolutely. Leadership transfers to no matter what your the job you have or what you're trying to build, teach, or learn. And one of the first people I met was the deputy director of the Marshall Center, just as I was coming into there. And once she retired, she was the head of Girl Scouts of America. So there's all kinds of transference of skills.
Question is over here.
Just recently, they put in the paper that all women's team located one of the mountain climbers that was lost 19 years ago in the valley, and I really hope somebody in the valley writes what this women's team did differently to find her, because they were saying that was one of the first times they had a leadership group that was all women doing mountain rescue, so little tip for a future book maybe. But I also find that, it was really fascinating to me that what is one of the gifts, that a woman would approach it differently? Are there things, as you've, again, with these women, what is it about a woman that you've seen that just tilts that equation differently for a 25-year-old woman to solve the male problem that nobody else could figure out how? Have you seen a trait or a thing?
So I met Charity Adams' son, Stanley Jr. After the war, she married a man who had been an interpreter for the Army, spoke perfect German. He wanted to go to medical school in the U.S. He couldn't because he was black. He went to Switzerland. Now, even if you speak a language, the medical pieces of a language are very different. And she finished her doctorate while she was there too. So it's the person's own skill set and their belief in their abilities. Her son told me that she was always the most prepared person in the room. They moved to Dayton, Ohio after he became a doctor, and she joined several boards, worked as the dean of women at a university, and he said she was the best prepared person in the room. She would go to a board meeting and they would say, "Okay, it's time for a vote. Does everybody approve?" And she would say, "Excuse me, on page 324, part 7A, paren 1, because she would read it all and know it all to make sure she did the right thing. And I think, we all do the right thing, but to that extent, sometimes we don't have the time, we don't have the inclination to do better than excellent. And a lot of these women did better than that because they wanted to make a difference. They wanted to serve and they wanted to do something for their country.
Mary Kay, we're hearing national trends around selfishness and loneliness. I wonder if you could speak to your experience in service and how an ethos of service in our country might help turn that tide a little bit.
Well, I think we're continuing to see now a little bit of a call for not forcing a national service, but encouraging maybe a gap year after high school or after college to spend a year doing something selfless, to do something greater than oneself, become part of something larger. And I don't care what that is. It doesn't have to be military service. It can be working for a community. In Maryland, they're going to start this to let high school graduates work for the state government because we need to have more civics education and understanding and how government works and how to do that. But I would be happy to build trails and, well, maybe there's the bear thing. But whatever you do is as a volunteer for a year, or go work on a ship and sail the world for a year. Do something outside your comfort zone, because at 18, it's the only time, we're not going to be encumbered by a mortgage and taxes and school and jobs and paying back student loans and all of those things. So I think the more that we continue to talk about the advantages of that, what it gives to you. I spent several years in Salt Lake, so I have a lot of friends who are LDS church members, and that's when they do the missions. Young men and women go on a mission for 18 to 24 months at age 18, and they don't come back home until they're done. And so they have a little bit more maturity when they come back and they're ready to take on whatever's next. I admire that.
Over here. When I think about women in the military, if you're looking at 1960, maybe they made up 1% of women in the military, maybe less. And then to now, probably know the numbers more than I do, but let's say it's under 20%.
It's about 18.
18, yeah, 17, 18%. So what stands out to me is that when I think about these women, and maybe even your experience in the military, how amazing, how precise, how they had to be 100 times better than everybody else to stand out, to be seen, to be recognized, to be counted as equal. So that's really kind of what lands with me, is that not only were they good, but they were incredible.
Not only were they good, they were incredible, and that's why I want to talk about what they did. Now, and some of that was at the beginning in World War II, well, if we're going to bring women into the service, they need to be high school graduates. Men did not have to be high school graduates. So, and if you wanted to join the Red Cross and become a donut dolly, which means you're in forward areas providing comfort with these vans, with newspapers, little music, take people's minds off what the days have been like. They had to be 25 years old, college graduates, mature, pleasing personality, all of those things, and able to handle themselves in difficult situations because they're not armed. So I think some of the requirements at first were because those making those rules didn't know what to expect. I'm not saying that that's right. I'm saying that's what they did. And sometimes when we want to judge the past by our views today, it just doesn't work. You know, we weren't there. We don't know why they did what they did. And for starting up the Women's Army Corps, they were doing that on the fly. They were writing the regulations while it was working. So I think we've seen continued adjustments to that and improvements over the years. And I talked about the police. There is a movement called 3030, started by Yvonne Roman, the former chief of police in Newark, New Jersey, which is to get the police departments in this country to 30% women by 2030. Greater success in arrests, less confrontation, less escalation, and greater outcomes for victims. And that's what the research data has shown for police departments that do that.
So we have a question from one of our online audience members asking if you've had experiences of discrimination or what your experiences were as a woman in the military.
You know, I've been asked that before. Ooh, how awful was it? Well, does that happen? Well, yes, of course it does. Of course it does. I mean, you have people in the military from all over the United States with every type of background, experience, beliefs, their own prejudices, and so you're going to experience their views imposed upon you. I mean, my first few months in the Army, we went on a day hike. And we went up this little hill, and one of the guys said to me, "Are you tired? Do I look tired?" So that's probably where the evil sense of humor began, because it was an adequate response to some of this. But so there is that. And I don't think I had to be 200% better in order to move up, but I had to be fully aware 360 of what's going on around me to understand all of these forces at work, whether it's plans that are being made. Now, when I was a young captain, I wanted to have company command, because that's what you need to move up. I had just gotten a scholarship, a full scholarship to complete my doctorate, and I had a follow-on assignment to teach at West Point. And my battalion commander said, "Women don't command in my unit." That killed out everything. I'll remember this, and I will learn from this, and I will go on, and I will do it anyway. And I did. So one door closes, you go kick the other one open. And that's what happens.
I think, I don't remember at what point, but you shared a story about being part of a delegation. Was it in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah, when you get promoted to general, there is a course called capstone, like a finishing course, you might call it, but it's not a protocol course. It's to teach you what happens at the highest levels, not just of the military, but of government and the State Department as well, so it's diplomacy. So it's 6 weeks. It's a little bit of travel to the headquarters within the United States and then overseas for another week. Now, I didn't get to go to Germany or the European trip because I'd been there. I didn't want to go to South America, so I got to go to the Middle East with 15 men as an honorary man. So I didn't have to wear the abaya, but it was certainly a lesson to me in other countries' views, even though they're our allies, and what they believe and what they see. And at one point, we were in a meeting, and this was in the United Arab Emirates, and one of the gentlemen working there came out and said to my colleagues, "Oh, you brought your servant." That was a mistake. That was a big mistake. And one of the guys I was with laughed. Called him out on that. When you see something, there's that saying, you see something, say something. I said lots of things. Inappropriate. You're there to represent your government, and this is what you want to do. Doesn't work for me, and I won't put up with it. So there it is. What are you going to do, leave me here? I used to say that every time I was in trouble. What are you going to do, shave my heads and send me overseas? Well, and then it happened, except for the shaving part. Oh. Does that make sense to you? I don't want anything special, you know? I just want to be left alone to do my job and enjoy it. And if you can't do that, I will tell you about it.
Other questions? Okay. Kat, you've got one more.
We might have a female president. How do you feel about that?
You're qualified. You've got all of the background. Sometimes it is that luck and timing. You know, is this the right time for this, to make this change in how we look at female leaders? When we have one in the European Parliament, we have several in other countries in Europe. We'll see how it comes out. But I don't think you can question the qualifications and the abilities. Don't make me talk about politics.
Yeah, if you want to hear about the election, come on October 5th to see David Gregory. He'll field all those questions. He's ready for it.
What he said.
Mary Kay, before we close out and thank everyone and have a chance to thank you formally, I wonder if you have closing thoughts for us. You get to speak all over the country, all over the world. You've managed communications at a global level. You've gotten to know our community here in this room. You've met our students.
Yeah.
And these can feel like hectic and harried times. And we know how fortunate we are to be able to live and spend time in a place like this. And as you can see, we've got a very curious and engaged group here. I wonder what you can offer us in terms of closing thoughts.
What I have found here is a sense of real community. That everybody I have met here, these are people who care. No, your schools are incredible. The students I met today are intelligent, excited, engaged, and they're going to make a difference in this world. And there isn't anything better than being able to see that next generation get ready so that we know what we're leaving is in good hands. And the more I can talk to groups like that, I'll go anywhere to do it.
Ladies and gentlemen, General Mary Kay Eder.
Thank you very much.